The Bible mentions 3 sons of Noah, but the oldest texts refer to a 4th name that was erased. That name disappeared from the official manuscripts, and what it conceals could change everything we know. For centuries, scholars accepted the canonical version without questioning it, but the archives tell a different story. The apocryphal texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Semitic oral traditions hold a disturbing secret. There is a bloodline that did not board the ark, a lineage that survived the flood through other means. The question that no one asks out loud is this: why was that name removed from the sacred record? It is not a copying error or an accidental omission, but rather a completely deliberate suppression. The evidence is scattered from Mesopotamia to Ethiopia, from Syria to the Dead Sea manuscripts. But to understand what was hidden, we must first return to the moment when the world was destroyed. Because the flood was not just a punishment, it was also an unprecedented genealogical cleansing operation. Genesis accurately describes that Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and apparently none others. However, the Book of Jasher, cited twice in the Old Testament, introduces a disturbing figure. That book mentions a previous son, born before Noah received the divine command to build the ark. His name varies depending on the source, but it most often appears as Ner, although some call him Yonit. Then the first contradiction arises. If it existed, why was it not included in the list of the canonical Genesis? The researchers of the Masoretic text found traces of editing in verses that describe the family. Those traces suggest that some scribe decided, at some point in history, to simplify the genealogy. But simplifying a sacred genealogy is no small act. It is an intervention with enormous consequences. To understand why, we must understand who that 4th son was and what his concrete existence represented. Ethiopian traditions preserved in the Book of Enoch speak of a mixed lineage between humans and celestial beings. That mixed line produced the Nephilim, the giants of chapter 6, sons of the so-called sons of God. However, the Nephilim did not completely disappear with the flood, and that is what the texts do not acknowledge. Because if the 4th child had mixed blood, the genealogical contamination survived within the ark itself. If he didn't board the ark, it's unclear how he survived the flood that was said to cover everything. Mesopotamian texts, especially the Sumerian versions of the flood, mention shelters outside the boat. Some traditions speak of caves in the mountains of Ararat that remained above the floodwaters. Other sources recovered at Tel El Amarna in the 20th century suggest the existence of underground shelters. However, the most disturbing clue does not come from archaeology, but from the linguistics of biblical texts. In ancient Hebrew, the word used for the survivors of the flood has an unexpected plural form. That plural suggests that not only Noah's family survived, but there were others, unnamed, who did as well. Scholars from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem have debated this point for decades without an official consensus. So, if there were other survivors, the narrative of the flood as a total extinction of the corrupt collapses. And with her, the logic of the ark as the only means of salvation, designed exclusively by the Creator, collapses. But let's return to the 4th son, because his story does not end with the flood, but in fact begins there. The Aramaic traditions, preserved in manuscripts from the 2nd century before Christ, describe him as a bearer of something. That something was the knowledge of the Watchers, the fallen angels who taught humans forbidden arts. The Book of Enoch details those arts of metallurgy, astronomy, alchemy, magic, and the precise art of war. That knowledge was precisely what provoked divine wrath and unleashed the flood according to the sacred narrative. However, if the fourth child possessed it, then that knowledge was not destroyed by the water, but preserved. This clarifies what archaeologists struggle to explain: the rise of civilizations. Because after the flood, in an astonishingly short period, Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley appear. Civilizations show astronomical and mathematical sophistication that seems unexplainable if they began from nothing. But if a bloodline with advanced knowledge survived, then that sudden emergence has a cause. Sumerian texts speak of the Anunnaki, beings who descended and taught humans the art of order. And in those same traditions appears Zusudra, the Sumerian equivalent of Noah, with a larger family. Zusudra has more descendants than the three canonical sons, and one is described as the bearer of the divine seal. That seal in Sumerian tradition signifies having been marked by the gods to preserve ancient knowledge. Thus, the link between the fourth Hebrew son and Sumerian tradition is not metaphorical. It is structurally identical. What is called forbidden knowledge in one tradition is called divine gift in another, but the function is the same. Preserve a line of continuity between the world before the flood and the world that emerged after the water. However, that continuity was precisely what the canonical text of Genesis wanted to erase from memory. Because a continuity implies that the flood was not a total reset, but merely a pause in something greater. And if it was a pause, then current humanity does not descend only from Noah, but from that parallel and hidden line. Modern geneticists have found something disturbing that fits this hypothesis in a surprisingly accurate way. In human mitochondrial DNA, there is a genetic bottleneck that occurred about 12,000 years ago. That bottleneck indicates that the human population was reduced to a very small number in a limited period. The troubling aspect is that this event led not to total genetic extinction, but to a subsequent diversification instead. And that diversification shows patterns that suggest multiple lines of origin, not a single exclusive family. Geneticists are cautious when interpreting this because the data alone do not confirm any text by themselves. But the convergence between genetics, archaeology, and apocryphal texts forms a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Because in all the cultures of the world, there is some version of the flood with survivors who are not the canonical ones. The Mayans speak of corn men who existed before the flood and preserved knowledge in sacred caves. The Hindus narrate how Manu saved not only his family, but also wise bearers of the eternal Vedas. The Chinese record in their chronicles a flood from which lineages that did not descend from the official monarch survived. And the Greeks, in the version of Deucalion, mention other survivors who were not directly created by Zeus. The question is no longer whether there was a fourth child, but why all cultures seem to remember something very similar. The most uncomfortable answer is that all those traditions preserve a real memory of something that history denied. But let's return to the Hebrew text, because it is there that the trace of the fourth son becomes more concrete and obscure. The Midrash, the rabbinic literature of biblical interpretation, contains a tradition that has been debated for centuries. That tradition speaks of a son of Noah named Canaan, different from the grandson Canaan mentioned as the son of Ham. Some rabbinic texts suggest that this original Canaan was the fourth son, not the grandson, and was cursed. The curse of Canaan is one of the darkest episodes of Genesis, and its textual justification is not clear. Ham saw his father naked, and Noah cursed Canaan, Ham's son, and not directly Ham, which is illogical. Unless Canaan was not simply the grandson, but a figure that represented something older and more threatening. Some scholars propose that the curse was inserted to justify the Israelite conquest of the Canaanite region. But others go further and suggest that Canaan was the code name for the forbidden lineage, the fourth son made flesh. Because the Canaanites, according to Genesis itself, were descendants of a lineage that predates the distribution of nations. And in Canaan, the Israelites found something that filled them with genuine terror: the Anakim, the giants of Arba. Those giants in Canaan are described as living remnants of the Nephilim, the same race that existed before the flood. However, the flood supposedly had extinguished them all, which creates an unsolvable contradiction. Unless a line, that of the fourth son, had survived and settled exactly in the Canaanite land. So the curse of Canaan is not just family disgrace, but the explicit condemnation of an entire genealogy. A genealogy that the texts wanted to bury beneath the narrative, but which emerged in every new generation. Because that blood, if it existed, could not disappear just because a compiler decided not to mention it in the text. The Dead Sea Scrolls have provided material that conventional scholars took time to integrate into the debate. In the Scroll of the Giants, found in Cave 4 of Qumran, names of Nephilim appear that are omitted in Genesis. Among those names, there is one that has particularly intrigued specialists: Mahaway, messenger among giants. Mahaway is described as a liminal being who could move between the human world and the world of giants. And that being, according to the Qumran text, survived the flood because its dual nature made it resistant to water. However, the text does not explain how. It only states that Mahaway crossed the waters and reached dry land. That land also appears in Tibetan traditions, in texts of the Bon culture that predate Buddhism itself. These texts speak of a physical territory, not a spiritual one, where the knowledgeable of the ancient world gathered. The most direct connection to the fourth son comes from the Mandaean texts of Mesopotamia, a Gnostic tradition. The Mandaeans preserve a deluge in which the spirit Hibil-Ziwa reveals to a fourth son the path to salvation. That route does not go through the Ark, but through an underground path to caverns where knowledge will be kept. The fourth son in the Mandaean version is named Sam-Shishlane, the one who bears the name that cannot be pronounced. That name is the true name of God, revealed by the fallen angels to men before the catastrophe. So the fourth son is not just a genealogical character, but the guardian of what the flood sought to destroy. And that makes him the most dangerous figure in the biblical narrative, more so than Cain, more than Nimrod himself. Because Cain was exiled and Nimrod was confused, but the fourth son was simply removed from the record. Erasing someone from a sacred text is the most radical act that a religious tradition can commit in its history. It implies that what that person represented was so threatening that even explicit condemnation was not enough. One had to act as if it never existed, turning it into a ghost whose shadow only appears in the marginal texts. And the margins of history are exactly where the most uncomfortable truths find their permanent refuge. The researchers who followed that marginal trail drew a line connecting the fourth son to the Rephaim. The Rephaim are another race of giants from the Old Testament, distinct from the Anakim, but equally feared. In Psalm 88, the Rephaim appear in Sheol as beings that inhabit the threshold between life and death. That liminal condition also defines the fourth son in the apocryphal texts as neither completely human nor completely other. However, the Rephaim in Canaan were physically present, warriors of height and power beyond the ordinary. And its territory, Bashan, was in Israelite tradition a threshold to the underworld, a place deeply cursed. The king of Bashan, Og, is the last Rephaim mentioned in the Bible, and his iron bed was 9 cubits long. And it persisted for generations, and that persistence was inexplicable if its lineage did not have some special resistance. Some rabbinical texts from the Babylonian Talmud claim that Og survived the flood clinging to the outside of the ark. That image of Og on the ship's helm, while the flood surrounds him, is one of the most disturbing in the canon. This suggests Noah knew of his presence and chose to exclude him, making the omission a conscious choice. And if Noah made that decision, then the genealogy of only 3 sons is also the result of an active will. 2 parallel omissions, Og outside the ark, and the 4th son outside the genealogical record of the canonical Genesis. Both point in the same direction. There was a will to erase an entire line of descent from history. That line didn't vanish from the text. It lived on in the hearts of the people who inherited it. And here we arrive at the most explosive connection that links the 4th son with the origin of the first civilizations. Because if that line carried the knowledge of the Watchers, the great human inventions have another real origin. Writing, the zodiac, monumental architecture, and bronze metallurgy appear without clear precedents. Archaeologists call this the sudden emergence of civilization, and do not have a satisfactory answer. However, if a line of knowledge survived outside the ark, that sudden emergence has a concrete cause. The bearers of that knowledge settled in Sumer, in Egypt, and transmitted what they had managed to preserve. And they transmitted it not as religion, but as technique, as social structure, as calendar, and as architecture. That's why early civilizations appear to have remembered something rather than starting from nothing. But remembering implies that in the world before the flood, that knowledge was common, not secret or reserved. That is exactly what the Book of Enoch describes, an era in which the Watchers freely taught everyone. However, that free knowledge was what caused the corruption that justified the flood, according to the narrative. Then, the flood was not only a punishment for corrupted humans, but also an operation to control knowledge. Those who knew too much were destroyed, but those who could be guided within the framework of obedience were preserved. Noah was the righteous man who obeyed without question and lacked the forbidden knowledge of the angels. His 3 canonized sons were the foundation of a new humanity built on forgetfulness and total obedience. But the 4th son represented the continuity with that past, the living memory of what the water wanted to erase. He couldn't enter the ark because his presence would have made the flood meaningless and ineffective. However, not rising did not mean disappearing, only that their story would be told in a different way. A fragmented way, dispersed in traditions that the guardians of the canonical text never managed to silence. Because knowledge, like water, always finds a crack, even when the stone seems absolutely solid. And the cracks are the apocryphal texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Mandaean traditions, and the Sumerian chronicles. In every crack, the same figure emerges, the one who didn't ascend, the keeper of the hidden name, the eternal guardian. Its existence explains why after the flood, the world was not a blank slate, but a battlefield. A field where Sem's line, blessed by Noah, collided with an older and much more resilient line. That older line is the one the Israelites found in Canaan, in Bashan, in the cities of the giants. And it is the same line that the apocryphal texts trace to the fourth son, the erased one who never disappeared. And that name, that of the sons of God, is in itself one of the most debated phrases in all of Scripture. Some theologians interpret it as angels, others as human rulers, but the text leaves no room for doubt. The immediate context of Genesis 6 describes beings who took human women and fathered mighty children. Those powerful sons, the Nephilim, are the link between the celestial world and the human world before the flood. And if the fourth son was the bearer of that link, then his erasure was not just editorial, it was theologically vital. Admitting blood survived implies the boundary between the divine and human was never truly solid. And that porous border is precisely what biblical monotheism needed to seal in order to affirm the uniqueness of God. However, the scriptures themselves leave it open in every mention of the giants, in every trace of the Anakim. So the tension is not between faith and science, but between two internal versions of the sacred text itself. A version that allows for mixing, the giants, the parallel line, and another that systematically erases it from sight. That internal tension strongly proves that something real was suppressed, leaving behind too many traces. Because when the editors of a text are skilled, they leave no traces. But here, the traces are everywhere. They are in the curse of Canaan, in the giants of Canaan, in Og of Bashan, in Mahaweh, and in Sam Shishlaim. All those names and figures form a constellation that only makes sense if one accepts that a star is missing. That missing star is Noah's fourth son, the one who was erased, but whose light continues to reach us from antiquity. And that light is not a metaphor. It is the concrete trace of a genealogy that traveled from before the flood to today. Up to the Canaanite cities, up to the Qumran archives, up to the Mandaean texts, up to the Sumerian chronicles. Until this research that brings together all those fragments for the first time in a coherent and verifiable narrative. Because historical truth does not live in the texts that are preserved, but in those that were almost destroyed forever. The most nearly erased is the trace of the fourth son, a character who was not meant to exist, but did. Today, thanks to decades of textual archaeology and comparative analysis, that trace is once again legible and disturbing. The story of the fourth son is actually the story of everything humanity has tried to forget about itself. And what humanity tries to forget, as psychology teaches and history confirms, always comes back in the end. Noah's fourth son is not a marginal myth. It is the key that connects the Nephilim with the origin of civilizations. If this mystery shook you, subscribe now to continue unearthing the darkest secrets of history.